The late afternoon sun, a molten orb beginning its slow, majestic descent towards the vast prairie horizon, cast long, skeletal shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the dusty yard, as Eliza moved a wraith in her own home. 3 months. It had been 3 agonizing, transformative months since the twins Ethan and Samuel had torn their way into the world. Their first cries, a fragile counterpoint to the vast, uncaring silence that so often enveloped their isolated cabin. As she hummed a tuneless lullaby, one her own mother had sung in a life that now felt impossibly distant. Eliza remembered a sacred vow whispered at her mother's graveside years before. "I will protect my children, Mama, as you always protected me with every breath I possess." Her hand stroked Ethan's downy hair. Samuel sighed in his sleep beside him, a tiny, perfectly formed fist curled instinctively around her finger. In the quiet solitude of pregnancy, before the exhaustion and the creeping dread had taken root, she had whispered stories to them in the womb, fantastical tales of them riding on cloud horses, their laughter echoing as they soared over these endless plains of a life painted in vibrant hues of joy and adventure, not the muted, suffocating grays that had become her daily reality. These fleeting, precious moments of tenderness with her infant sons were the only anchors in the roiling, unpredictable sea of her days. Her husband, Thomas, was a man of increasingly shifting moods. His laughter when it came too loud and brittle. His silences too deep, too frequent, like chasms she feared falling into. Lately, the silences had all but consumed him. He'd been riding out more often, his face drawn into a perpetual grimace, his eyes holding a furtive, restless gleam she didn't recognize, and which chilled her to the bone. Made some new acquaintances, Eliza. He'd slurred one night, his breath thick with the cloying aroma of cheap spirits. Important men, friends in the right places now. One in particular knows the law, understands how things really work. Calls himself BC. Very discreet, very effective. A man needs powerful allies, especially when he's got obligations. An unsettling image flickered in Eliza's mind. Thomas in hushed conversation with a tall, imposing figure near the general store. Last week, a man whose deputy's badge glinted briefly in the sun, someone who looked disquietingly like the sheriff's man, Ben Coulter. The initials, the description. A cold seed of suspicion took root, though she quickly dismissed it as paranoia. His words, vague yet laden with a dark undertone, had pricked at her unease. Today, he was gone again. Town business. He'd mumbled, his gaze skittering away from hers like a startled insect escaping a predator. But not before she caught the stale, sour scent of whiskey lingering on his breath, even at that early hour. The babies finally slept, 2 small, warm bundles in the cradle he'd reluctantly cobbled together after weeks of her pleading its construction as crude and ill-fitting as his recent affection. A strange, persistent disquiet hummed beneath Eliza's skin, a dissonant chord in the fragile symphony of new motherhood. A feeling that had been insidiously growing for weeks, like a malignant storm gathering just over the visible horizon. It was this gnawing unease, a cold premonition, that tightened her chest into an iron band, a splinter of pure dread embedded deep in her marrow, that led her against her better judgment to his satchel. It lay carelessly discarded on the rough-hewn table, a symbol of his growing indifference. She shouldn't. Every instinct, every vestige of wifely loyalty she still possessed, screamed against the violation. But the pull, the cold, coiling dread in her stomach, the urgent need to know what darkness he was consorting with, was too strong, too irresistible to deny. Her fingers clumsy from pervasive fatigue and a tremor she couldn't control. A tremor born not of cold, but of something far more insidious, cracking through her carefully constructed composure. Fumbled with the stiff leather straps of the satchel. Inside, amidst a disordered jumble of tally sheets covered in his messy, almost illegible scrawl, and a sheaf of promissory notes she didn't fully understand. One for a particularly staggering sum bore the neatly scrawled initials BC beneath Thomas's as a guarantor, a detail that snagged in her mind with a peculiar, icy unease that echoed Thomas's earlier mention was a thicker document. It was folded precisely in unfamiliar neatness for Thomas and bore an imposing, official-looking seal. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. A wild flame buffeted by a gale, its frantic, painful pulse echoing in the sudden stillness of the cabin, almost drowning out the gentle breaths of her sleeping children with hands that shook so violently she could barely control them. She unfolded it, the words printed in stark, brutal black ink against the creamy, expensive-looking parchment, swam before her blurring eyes. Transfer of custody and care. Her own name, Ethan's name, Samuel's name, and then the other party designated as the recipient. The Moral Reform Settlement of Redemption County, NOR. Thomas's signature, a confident, almost arrogant looping scrawl at the bottom, mocked her from the page witnessed by two names she vaguely recognized from town, and stamped with the official seal of Mayor Thompson himself, an exchange, a trade. Her and her infant sons for the clearing of significant and outstanding debts of a pecuniary nature, incurred through extensive participation in games of chance. Gambling. He was selling them, selling his wife and his newborn children to settle his gambling debts. The dreams of cloud horses shattered into a million razor-sharp fragments. Her heart a stone, breaking beneath a relentless hammer. The air rushed from her lungs with the force of a physical blow. The room tilted the familiar, comforting lines of the small cabin, warping and distorting as if viewed through flawed glass. The Moral Reform Settlement whispers. She'd heard them in town during her infrequent visits for supplies, hushed and fearful pronouncements exchanged between women in shadowed corners like the rustle of unseen snakes in dry prairie grass. They spoke of women who voiced opinions too loudly, who dared to question their husbands, who stepped too far out of the narrowly prescribed lines of feminine conduct, or simply when their husbands tired of them deeming them difficult or melancholic, a place of moral correction. They called it a sanctuary for troubled souls. But the eyes of those who spoke of it, often in hushed tones when they thought no men were listening, never held any spark of hope, only a chilling, echoing emptiness, a haunted vacancy that belied the benign name. This contract, this cold, legalistic, utterly soul-crushing betrayal, painted a far more sinister, terrifying picture. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was a prison farm, a human market where souls were bartered and futures extinguished. Her mind reeled desperately, trying to piece together the scattered, horrifying fragments into a coherent, if monstrous, whole. The contract spoke with chillingly detached formality of the settlement taking full legal possession. It spoke of rehabilitation and moral guidance, specifically for her. But the undercurrent, the unspoken threat lurking menacingly between the meticulously penned lines, was terrifyingly clear. She was to be an inmate, a possession her precious sons leverage, mere commodities to ensure her complete and utter compliance. The document went on to detail the settlement's sweeping authority granted by a powerful coalition of men whose names she recognized with a fresh, sickening stab of fear. Bankers who held the deeds to half the town, influential pastors whose Sunday sermons dripped with condemnation for any woman who dared to possess a will of her own, and local lawmen whose concept of justice was often notoriously selective, serving primarily the wealthy and powerful. She was meant to wake up in chains, bound and gagged, or worse already, on a jostling wagon bound for that dreadful, unholy place. The thought struck her with the stunning force of a physical blow, stealing her breath again, leaving her gasping. This wasn't a distant, abstract threat. This was imminent. Thomas would return, perhaps, with these associates, these buyers, and she would be taken, drugged into submission, branded like livestock, silenced, her very identity stripped away until she was nothing but a hollow shell. And her babies, oh God, her babies, a fresh wave of debilitating nausea washed over her, threatening to buckle her knees. The contract was chillingly, deliberately vague about the ultimate fate of the children, mentioning only appropriate placement and future provision based on their projected station in life. But she'd heard the darker rumors too, and the whispers that slithered through the town like poisoned smoke. Whispers of children sold off to childless couples, wealthy enough to afford the price, or worse, raised within such hellish places as indentured companions. Their futures erased before they had even truly begun, their spirits deliberately broken young to ensure obedience. The floorboards creaked loudly, a sudden sharp sound in the oppressive silence. Eliza froze her blood, turning to ice water in her veins. Was he back already? Had he sensed her discovery? She clutched the contract, and the stiff paper crinkling in her desperate grip, the sound deafening in the sudden profound silence of the small cabin. The sounds were just the old house settling, groaning under the weight of its years and the burden of its terrible secrets. But the fear was a living thing now, a tangible entity coiling around her throat, constricting her breath, squeezing the very life from her. She had to leave now. There was no other choice. There was no time for deliberation, no room for doubt. Her gaze, tear-filled and frantic, fell upon the sleeping twins, their small faces serene and utterly innocent. Their tiny rosebud mouths suckling faintly in their dreams, wholly unaware of the yawning abyss that waited just beyond their fragile slumber. A surge of fierce primal protectiveness, potent and all-consuming, coursed through her veins, a mother bear's incandescent rage, burning away the debilitating fog of shock and despair. She would not let this happen. She would not let him take them. She would not let their lives and their very souls be erased by his greed and cruelty barefoot. She moved with a desperate, silent urgency. She hadn't known she possessed every nerve alive and thrumming with adrenaline. No time for shoes, no time for gathering provisions beyond what she could snatch in fleeting, panicked moments. She snatched a worn, familiar shawl, its soft wool a small, inadequate comfort against the chill of her fear, and bundled the still sleeping babies tightly, fashioning crude slings from strips of a torn bedsheet to secure one against each hip and their small bodies a precious, fragile weight against her. The contract, the damning, irrefutable proof of his monstrous betrayal. She thrust into the bodice of her dress, its sharp, unforgiving edges digging into her skin, a constant, painful reminder of the treachery she fled and the monumental stakes of her flight. The cabin door opened with a protesting groan, a sound that seemed to echo with mocking finality across the entire, vast, silent prairie. The vast, indifferent wilderness stretched before her, an endless expanse of low scrub and deep shadow, under a sky slowly bruising with the dramatic purples and oranges of the approaching night. Behind her lay a life built on lies, a husband who had callously condemned her and their innocent children with the casual flick of a pen. Ahead, an unknown, terrifying expanse, but also perhaps a chance, a sliver of hope as thin and fragile as a spider's thread. Yet something to cling to. She ran, not with grace, not with any conscious thought for direction beyond away. Only with the desperate, instinctual, animalistic need to put as much distance as humanly possible between herself and that accursed cabin, between her beloved sons and the hideous fate Thomas had so casually, so monstrously sealed for them. The rough, unforgiving ground tore at her bare feet. Sharp stones hid in thorns and coarse grit ripped at her tender flesh, each stab of pain. A spike driving deeper into her resolve. Short, sharp gasps of pain punctuated her ragged, burning breaths, the fear a tangible entity, sharp as a shard of glass in her lungs, her heart like a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. She barely registered the new spreading agony, driven by an adrenaline-fueled terror that overshadowed all physical sensation. Her only coherent thought, a frantic repeating litany in her mind, was of the pursuit that would surely come. He needed the children alive and unharmed, according to the devil's bargain he'd made with those soulless men. That was the horrifying, chilling detail that echoed in her mind. A grotesque perversion of paternal care, a cruel irony that fueled her flight. He needed them to complete his monstrous transaction. The first night was a disorienting blur of raw terror and bone-deep, mind-numbing exhaustion. The plaintive cries of the babies, woken abruptly by the jolting, desperate run, and the sharp, biting cold of the night air, were small, pitiful sounds, lost in the immense, uncaring darkness of the wilderness. She found a shallow ravine, a slight depression in the earth, and huddled beneath a meager overhang of rock and thorny acacia branches, trying desperately to shield them from the biting wind, her own trembling body, a poor, inadequate substitute for warmth and comfort. She tried to nurse them, but her milk was scant, her body already severely depleted and reacting violently to the profound stress and terror. A fear that felt like wind whistling through her very bones. Hunger gnawed at her belly. A dull, persistent ache that was nothing compared to the sharp, biting dread that twisted her insides. Every rustle of leaves in the chilling wind, every snap of a distant, unseen twig, sounded like approaching hoofbeats, the heavy, impatient drumming of Thomas's fists on the cabin door. Sleep was an impossibility, a luxury she could not afford. Dawn broke gray-cold and unforgiving, revealing a desolate landscape that offered little comfort, only endless miles of harsh, unforgiving terrain stretching to every horizon. She pushed on, stumbling, driven by a raw, primal will, her body a burning protest, her feet leaving bloody prints on the sharp stones, and the memory of her mother's whispered promise, a desperate mantra. The sun, a merciless eye in the pale sky, climbed higher, beating down relentlessly. Her throat was parched, a dry, aching cavern. Her lips cracked and bled, and the babies were frighteningly listless now, their cries weaker, more like pathetic whimpers, a sound that tore at her soul more than any physical pain she endured. Delirium began to set in its insidious tendrils, creeping at the edges of her vision. Thomas's face contorted in a sneer of frustrated rage. The smug, impassive visages of the men whose names adorned the contract, their condemnations whispering accusingly from the dancing heat hazes shimmering on the distant horizon. The second night descended blacker and more terrifying than the first. She stumbled on her legs, moving by rote memory alone, each step an agony, her feet numb and bleeding. She knew they were behind her. She could almost feel their malevolent presence, a dark shadow stretching out to ensnare her. Thomas's frustrated, enraged bellows carried faintly on the wind, or perhaps only in her fevered imagination. The contract in her bodice felt like a burning brand searing against her skin. It was her condemnation, the proof of her ruin. But also, she prayed, perhaps her only weapon. If she could just reach someone, anyone who would listen, who would believe her unbelievable story. By the third day, the world had dissolved into a tormenting, surreal haze of unbearable heat, choking dust, and a desperate, all-consuming thirst that dwarfed every other sensation. The babies were terrifyingly silent now, their small bodies frighteningly still and unnervingly light against hers. It was this profound, unnatural silence, more than the tearing agony of her feet or the sun scorching her unprotected skin, that finally broke her. She fell not so much a collapse as a slow, wilting, resigned descent onto the parched, cracked earth. She lay there, the indifferent sun searing her exposed skin, and the vast, empty sky mocking her futility. This was it. This was where her desperate flight would end, where she would die, her babies dying with her. Their brief, innocent lives extinguished by their own father's insatiable greed and cruelty. Then, through a shimmering haze of heat and deepening despair, she saw it, a flicker, a distortion that wasn't a mirage born of delirium, a fence line, wooden posts stark against the bleached grass. And beyond it, the sprawling, reassuring, almost unbelievable shapes of a ranch. Buildings, a windmill turning slowly, lazily in the faint breeze, and faintly the distant, comforting lowing of cattle. Hope, a fragile, tenacious, almost forgotten thing, so faint She almost dismissed it as another cruel trick of her failing mind, flickered desperately within her exhausted heart. With the very last dregs of her strength, a hidden reserve she didn't know she possessed, she crawled, dragging herself and her precious, terrifyingly still bundles towards that impossible, longed-for salvation. She reached a dusty track leading towards a large, well-kept two-story ranch house. Her voice, when she tried to call out, was a dry, ragged rasp, barely a whisper. More expelled air than actual sound. She couldn't ask for shelter, not for herself. All that mattered, and the only thing that mattered in the entire universe were the babies. She saw a figure on the wide porch, a woman, her silhouette strong and capable against the harsh, bright afternoon light. Milk. Eliza croaked the single word tearing from her raw, swollen throat, tasting of dust, blood, and utter desperation. Please, for my baby's milk. Josephine Carter turned at the sound. Her eyes the clear, intense color of a stormy sky, narrowing with keen, immediate observation, as she took in the shocking, pitiable spectacle staggering towards her. A woman barely more than a girl, caked in dirt and dried blood, her dress torn to shreds, exposing blistered skin, her feet a bloody, unrecognizable ruin. And in her arms, held with a desperate, weakening grip, two tiny infants, frighteningly still. Their delicate skin pale and waxy. Josephine was no stranger to hardship. But the daughter of a man who had carved this vast, prosperous ranch from the hostile wilderness with his own bare hands, indomitable will, and unyielding spirit. She'd seen desperation in many forms over the years. But this was something rawer, something more primal, something that resonated with a deep, hidden ache within her own fiercely guarded spirit. Without a word, she moved her stride long and purposeful, descending the porch steps with a quiet urgency. She gently, carefully took one of the babies from Eliza's trembling, reluctant arms, her touch surprisingly tender for a woman whose hands were calloused and hardened from years of demanding ranch work. "Bring them inside," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, a command cloaked in an undeniable, instinctive compassion. "Martha will see to them." The cool, dim interior of the ranch house was a shock after the relentless, blinding glare of the sun. Eliza sagged heavily against the doorframe, her legs finally utterly refusing to hold her any longer. Josephine was already moving with brisk efficiency, calling out sharp but calm orders to a startled older housekeeper named Martha, whose kind face immediately softened with concern at the sight of Eliza and the infants. "Oh, the poor, sweet mites." Martha murmured, her voice a soothing balm as she bustled to retrieve and warm fresh milk. "And you, child, you look like you've been through the devil's own ringer and spat out the other side." As Josephine carefully coaxed a few precious drops of warmed milk between the lips of the infant she held, Martha gently bathed Eliza's dust-caked face with a cool, damp cloth and pressed a cup of water to her cracked lips. Eliza watched tears streaming down her face, mingling with the dust and grime. Each drop of milk that a baby swallowed a small, miraculous victory against the encroaching darkness. "My name is Josephine Carter," the woman said once the immediate crisis of the baby's nourishment had been addressed. Her gaze was steady, direct, and assessing on Eliza. "And you are?" Eliza Miller." The name felt foreign on her tongue, a painful relic from a life that had been shattered, stolen from her. And these little ones, strong names, I hope, for such a harsh journey. Ethan and Samuel. A faint flicker of pride touched her lips as she spoke their names. As the babies, under the gentle, practiced care of Martha and Josephine, began to stir more actively their faint, weak cries. Now a blessed, life-affirming sound. After the terrible, unnatural silence of the wilderness, Josephine listened intently. Eliza, her voice hoarse and broken, frequently interrupted by racking coughs, poured out her story, the words tumbling over each other in her haste. Her raw desperation, a palpable force in the quiet, comfortable room. And then, with a hand that still shook so violently she could barely hold it steady, she produced the damning contract from her bodice, its creases now softened by her sweat, its sharp edges dulled, but its message no less brutal. Josephine took the document, her expression turning grim, then hardening into cold fury as she scanned the dense legalistic phrases. She read it slowly, methodically, her keen, intelligent eyes missing nothing. The names of the signatories, the insidious clauses, the official seals from their own town, lending a terrifying legitimacy to the vile transaction. A cold, dangerous anger settled in her features, an anger Eliza recognized with a jolt, for it mirrored the inferno raging within her own heart. The moral reform settlement. Josephine said the words flat, almost devoid of outward emotion, but laden with a heavy, resonant knowing. I know of it, and of Redemption County. They choose their names to inspire trust, don't they? A cruel mockery. A flicker of something raw, intensely personal passed through Josephine's eyes, a shadow of old, unhealed pain briefly exposed. My sister, she said, her voice suddenly quiet, tight, with suppressed grief. Sarah, she was taken there, or one like it. 5 years ago, her husband, Robert Coulter, claimed she was unwell. Melancholic after a stillbirth, a trial to him. He had a doctor, a man beholden to him, declare her unstable. They sent her to a sanctuary up north, promising gentle care and recovery. We never heard from her again. Not a single letter. The official word delivered 6 months later was that she had succumbed to her ailment and was buried on their grounds. Josephine's strong hand clenched on the armrest of her chair, her knuckles white. Her husband, Robert Coulter. He always deferred to others for the difficult things and seemed almost relieved to be rid of her sharp mind and her unwillingness to be silenced. His brother Ben, a sheriff's deputy even back then, a rising man in the county. He was the one who processed all the paperwork, who assured my father and me with such calm official confidence that it was all perfectly legal. And for Sarah's ultimate best, he spoke so calmly, so officially. But it always left a cold knot in my stomach, the way he never quite met my eye when he spoke of her recovery, the slight tremor in his hand when he passed my father. The final committal forms, he said it was for her own good, that some women just weren't resilient enough for this world. The memory of his hollow words was like acid. Eliza stared at her, a dawning, horrified understanding connecting the almost invisible threads of shared sorrow and profound betrayal. Josephine wasn't just a compassionate stranger stumbled upon by chance. She was a fellow traveler in a desolate landscape of loss and systemic malevolent injustice. One who knew firsthand the insidious reach and ruthless nature of these so-called reformers, and the men who enabled them. Josephine called for her father, Daniel Carter, a grizzled, powerfully built man, whose eyes, though older, held the same quiet strength and unwavering resolve as his daughter's. He listened to Eliza's harrowing story, his weathered face growing harder, stonier with every word, his massive hand clenching into a fist that spoke of barely contained rage when Josephine showed him the contracts, pointing out the signatories. This is damnable. Old Mr. Carter rumbled his voice like distant gathering thunder. I've heard the whispers for years, Josephine good. Women, strong women, inconvenient women, just gone, vanished, that settlement, and others like it. Always seemed like a wolf masquerading in sheep's clothing. Redemption County, a pretty name for a place that likely offers nothing but damnation. This Mayor Thompson, these bankers, that sniveling pastor Albright. They're vultures feeding on the vulnerable. He turned to Eliza, his gaze surprisingly gentle. Years ago, a young fella, barely a man, tried to take something from me, thought I was an easy mark. Learned otherwise. We protect what's ours here, lass. You're safe now. My Jo, she's got a fire in her, same as her mother did. And I've got enough good men who'd ride to hell and back for the Carters. They will come for her, Papa. Josephine said, her gaze steady, resolute, meeting his. Thomas Miller will not give up easily. The contract specifies the children are vital to fulfilling his debt. He has powerful, unscrupulous backers who will want their investment protected. Let them try. He said, his eyes glinting with a fierce, protective light that Eliza found immensely reassuring. This ranch was built on defiance and Carter blood. They'll find more than they bargained for here, Jeb. He called out, his voice carrying easily through the house. His foreman, a lean, sun-weathered man with eyes like chips of granite, appeared silently in the doorway. Jeb, round up all the hands. I want double the watch tonight, and every man armed. I want eyes on the perimeter and at every approach from now until this is settled. No one gets near this house or this woman and her babes without answering to us. Is that clear? Clear as crystal, Mr. Carter? Jeb said, his gaze flicking briefly to Eliza and the infants with a flicker of something akin to sympathy before he nodded and disappeared. Later that evening, as Eliza, wrapped in a warm quilt, sipped nourishing broth in the kitchen, feeling a little strength seeping back, Martha sat with her knitting needles clicking. A commotion outside startled them. Jeb burst in his face tight. Miss Josephine found fresh tracks a mile out east by the creek. 3 riders, well mounted. They scattered when my scout, young Billy, got close. But they were headed this way for certain. They were good riders, not just drifters. Josephine's jaw tightened. They're probing testing or lost their nerve for a direct night approach. Papa, we need to be ready for anything. Daniel Carter nodded, his face grim. They know we're fortified, but desperate men do desperate things. A tense hour passed, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sighs of the sleeping babies. Eliza, holding a now fretfully sleeping Ethan, heard Josephine and her father discussing defensive positions in low, urgent tones. Then a sharp, almost inaudible whisper from Jeb at the back door, who'd been out with another scout. Someone's at the edge of the wood line, north side, using the gully for cover. Almost made it to the old well before scouting. Billy spooked him proper this time. They're definitely here, Miss Carter, and bolder than I thought. Moving with purpose. Daniel Carter himself moved to a side window, peering out into the moon-dappled darkness. After a long moment, he turned back. They're testing the north fence line now, just like Jeb said, smart, trying to draw us out, but careless. Billy's got them marked. He's signaling, and they think they're unseen. Josephine absorbed this, her expression steely. Keep them occupied there if they press Billy. She called out softly towards a runner. Jeb, you and 2 others cover the east approach, silent as ghosts. The main drive is too obvious for a primary assault, but we watch it all the same, every shadow. Eliza, overhearing this calm, precise planning of a potential firefight, felt a fresh wave of icy fear grip her heart, making it hard to breathe. They were so close, like wolves circling. You rest now, dear, Martha said softly, her eyes kind, sensing Eliza's renewed terror despite the palpable tension that now filled the house. Josephine and her father, they're good people, strong people. You're safe here. I don't know how to thank you. Eliza whispered, her voice choked. No thanks needed, child. Martha replied, placing a comforting hand on Eliza's arm. Just seeing those little ones safe is thanks enough. I had a sister once. Faced a hard time with a cruel man, didn't have a place like this to run to. Knowing there's good folk left, it matters. As night deepened, the ranch house felt like a besieged fortress. They'll likely wait for full dark or first light. Josephine muttered, checking the action of her Winchester for the 3rd time. Eliza watched her, her fear a cold, tight knot in her stomach, a live thing coiling tighter with every passing minute. He valued those gambling debts, those promises to evil men, more than us. Eliza whispered again, the raw wound of betrayal still bleeding into her voice. He'll never give up on this cursed deal. Josephine placed a reassuring hand on her arm, her grip surprisingly firm. Then neither will we, Eliza. He'll find this Carter rock harder to break than he imagines. You're under our roof now. and that means something here. Something sacred. She then retrieved the rifle, its blued steel gleaming dully in the lamplight. "Can you use one of these?" she asked, her voice calm, betraying none of the tension. Eliza felt radiating from her. Eliza shook her head, a fresh wave of inadequacy washing over her. I've never even held a gun, Thomas. He said it wasn't a woman's place. He never allowed it." "Then your weapon?" Josephine said, her gaze shifting to the contract that now lay on the sturdy oak table between them, a stark testament to human depravity. "Is this truth and a mother's unwavering will sometimes, Eliza? That combination is more powerful, more devastating than any bullet." They didn't have to wait for dawn. As dusk began to fully settle, casting the outbuildings in long, eerie shadows and painting the western sky in dramatic hues of blood orange and deep violet, the distinct sound of approaching horses reached them. 3 riders moving at a determined, confident pace, no longer scouting but advancing directly, dark, ominous silhouettes against the rapidly fading light. Josephine stood on the wide front porch, her father a steadfast, armed presence just behind her in the shadows of the doorway. Eliza hovered just inside the cool metal of the door latch, pressed hard into her palm, clutching her sons, who were now awake again, and fretfully nursing their small, warm bodies, a tangible reason to fight to survive. The air was thick with unspoken tension, a fragile, electrically charged quiet before a violent storm. "Thomas Miller," Josephine called out, her voice ringing clear and sharp in the twilight stillness, amplified by the tense, unnatural quiet of the ranch yard. "State your business at the Carter Ranch. You are not welcome unannounced." Thomas reined in his horse, its breath pluming white in the rapidly cooling air. His face illuminated by the flickering porch light Mr. Carter had lit was a carefully constructed mask of feigned concern and paternalistic authority. "I'm here for my wife, Eliza." He called back, his voice, attempting a solicitous, almost gentle tone that cracked noticeably with underlying strain and impatience. "And for my beloved sons, of course, she's unwell, ma'am. I'm afraid deeply confused, prone to flights of fancy. Bless her fragile heart. She needs proper care, the kind I've painstakingly arranged for her own good." The 2 men with him, hulking, shadowy silhouettes, began to subtly edge their horses forward, instinctively flanking him, their movements predatory and menacing. One was the burly, brutish-looking man with a livid scar bisecting his eyebrow. Guise, a known brawler and enforcer from town. The other slimmer, his face almost entirely obscured by the shadow of his hat. Brim remained ominously still, his posture one of cold, silent assessment. "She seems perfectly lucid and remarkably determined to me," Josephine replied, her tone as sharp and cold as a sudden winter wind. She took a deliberate step forward on the porch, the Winchester held loosely, but with undeniable readiness at her side, its polished barrel gleaming ominously in the lamplight. "And more importantly, she doesn't wish to go with you, Thomas. She has claimed sanctuary here under Carter protection." "Now see here, ma'am." Thomas blustered, his voice, rising, the thin veneer of pretense slipping away like a poorly fitting mask. "This is a purely family matter, a private affair between a man and his wife. It does not concern you or yours in the slightest." He gestured impatiently, his horse sidestepping nervously beneath him. "Eliza, stop this foolishness at this instant and come out here. You're upsetting the children, making them ill, and making a shameful spectacle of yourself and our family." "It concerns me greatly, Thomas Miller." Josephine retorted, her voice lashing out each word, a whip crack of righteous condemnation. "When a man signs a legal contract to sell his wife and newborn children into a place I know to be a living hell simply to cover his pathetic gambling debts." She held up the damning contract, the parchment catching the lamplight, its official seal starkly visible. A brand of his shame. This document Thomas Miller signed, sealed, and witnessed by Mayor Thompson himself concerns me very greatly. Selling your own family like chattel. There's no lower act for a man. Thomas's face contorted, paling then flushing with a visible wave of desperate, cornered fury. The mask was completely gone now, revealing the snarling, terrified rat beneath. She stole that. That's a private, confidential agreement. You have no right whatsoever, to interfere in my affairs. Right, echoed a gruff, contemptuous voice. Guise, the larger henchman, spat deliberately onto the porch steps. We got rights, lady. The right to take what's lawfully his. This is just business, simple as that. Give 'em up nice and easy, and no one gets hurt more than is absolutely necessary. He reached deliberately openly with menacing slowness for the peacemaker holstered at his hip. Before his fingers could curl around the butt of the pistol, a shot rang out sharp and definitive. Not from Josephine, but from a darkened window of the ranch house to her left where Jeb Carter was positioned. The bullet slammed into the wooden porch railing mere inches from Guise's outstretched hand and leg, sending a shower of sharp splinters into the air, stinging his cheek. He froze instantly, his hand hovering just above his weapon, his eyes wide with surprise and a sudden healthy caution. The next one won't be a warning, friend, came Jeb Carter's gravelly voice from the shadows within. This is Carter land. As far as I can see, you're trespassers, attempted kidnappers, and frankly, vermin. Lower your hand, Noli. Thomas shrieked, his voice, high-pitched and thin with terror. Don't shoot, for God's sake, don't shoot. She's my wife, legally my property. You can't just... He turned desperately to Guise, his face a mask of panicked greed and frustration. Get her. Get the children. The contract explicitly states they need to be delivered unharmed, but it doesn't say a damned thing about her condition. He himself looked poised to dismount, his wild eyes darting towards Eliza, who cowered further into the doorway, Guise recovering his brutish bravado with a snarl, and perhaps spurred by Thomas's desperate command, lunged suddenly towards the steps, clearly intending to rush Josephine and seize Eliza and the babies. You can't stop all of us, you interfering ranch woman. He bellowed. Eliza, clutching her babies tighter, cried out a choked sob of pure terror, and stumbled back further into the relative darkness of the doorway, her heart a frantic, painful drum against her ribs. One of the twins startled by the shout, and her sudden movement let out a frightened, piercing wail. Josephine moved with lightning speed to block Guise's path, bringing the Winchester up to a direct firing position, her face a grim, unforgiving mask of determination. Just as Guise reached the bottom step, his eyes fixed on Eliza, he made a savage, lightning-fast grab for the nearest baby in Eliza's arms. Eliza screamed a raw, animalistic sound, yanking Ethan back with all her might, stumbling dangerously as Guise's thick, dirty fingers brushed the swaddling clothes. For a terrifying instant, she felt the weight of Ethan shift, the sickening sensation of his potential loss. But Josephine, anticipating the move, reacted instantly, and she didn't fire. Instead, she brought the heavy steel barrel of the Winchester down in a swift, brutal arc, connecting with a sickening thud against Guise's temple. Touch them again, she hissed, her voice low and lethal, and I will scatter your brains across this entire yard without a second thought. Guise recoiled with a grunt of pain and surprise, his eyes furious, but momentarily cowed his hand, flying to his throbbing head. He stumbled, then recovering a measure of his brutishness, drew his pistol with a snarl and fired wildly. The shot ripped through the sleeve of a Carter ranch hand. Miguel visible in another window, the crack of the bullet hitting flesh and bone was sickeningly distinct, followed by a sharp cry of, "Miguel, he's hit!" and a muffled curse from Daniel Carter. The air was suddenly thick with the scent of gunpowder and imminent deadly violence. Guise, emboldened by his shot, seeing a chance, shoved past Josephine's renewed defense, pushing her off balance with his bulk and sending her staggering back into the house. For a heart-stopping moment, he was inside the doorway. Josephine met his rush, her body a shield for Eliza. The narrow hall became a vortex of violence. Guise roared, a mindless beast, his dirty hands scrabbling for purchase, trying to push past Josephine. One huge hand lunged, snagging the edge of Samuel's sling. Eliza shrieked, twisting desperately away, the fabric tearing with a sickening rip. Josephine, with a surge of adrenaline, drove her elbow into Guise's exposed throat, then slammed her boot hard onto his instep, the crunch of bone barely audible over his choked gasp as he fell back howling onto the porch. It was then, in that split second of desperate struggle and distraction, that the second man and the slimmer one, who had remained mostly in shadow, suddenly spurred his horse forward, cutting a sharp angle towards the side of the porch, his intent terrifyingly clear: to get around Josephine's defense directly to Eliza and the babies. Enough of this damned foolishness. He shouted, his voice raspy tight with urgency, and to Josephine chillingly, sickeningly familiar. We take them now. Miller, cover me. As he moved into a clearer patch of light, spilling from the open doorway, his hat tilting back slightly from the sudden movement, revealing his features fully, Josephine, even as she kneed the fallen Guise hard in the ribs, sending him sprawling further back onto the porch, groaning, gasped. It was a choked, ragged sound, torn from the very depths of her being. A horrified fusion of disbelief and dawning, sickening, gut-wrenching horror that momentarily rooted her to the spot. Ben. She whispered the name, a mere ghost on her lips, barely audible above the frantic pounding in Eliza's ears and Thomas's now frantic, encouraging urgings to his remaining accomplice, Ben Coulter. The man flinched violently, as if struck by an invisible whip. He reined in his horse so sharply that it reared its hooves, churning the dust, his eyes suddenly wide with the trapped, panicked look of a cornered animal. His face, now fully undeniably visible in the lamplight, was one Josephine had known for years, one inextricably associated with strained family dinners after Sarah's committal uncomfortable county fairs, where he'd offered stilted condolences and the unbearable, suffocating 5-year-long grief of her sister's unexplained loss. Her brother-in-law, Sarah's husband's brother, a sheriff's deputy, a man sworn to uphold the law, not to twist and subvert it for profit and callous cruelty. Eliza saw the color drain completely from Josephine's usually composed face, replaced by a glacial, terrifying fury that was far more frightening in its intensity than any shouted threat, making the Winchester in her hands seem a natural, deadly extension of her very will. The recognition, the sudden, terrible understanding of the sheer depth and breathtaking intimacy of the layers of betrayal struck Eliza with a fresh, paralyzing wave of horror. This man, this supposed lawman, wasn't just another callous accomplice for hire. He was intricately, despicably woven into the very fabric of this vile, predatory system, a profound betrayer of trust, of family, of his solemn oath to protect and serve. A wild shot suddenly erupted from Guise, who had recovered enough to blindly fire his pistol from a half-crouched position on the porch floor. The bullet whizzed harmlessly past Josephine's head, thudding into the thick wood of the porch post with a solid thwack, showering her with tiny splinters. She barely flinched, her unwavering gaze still locked on Ben Coulter, Josephine. Ben Coulter said, his voice strained, pleading, a sheen of sweat glistening on his upper lip, despite the cool night air. He held his hands up, palms open in a gesture of placation that seemed utterly hollow. It's not what you think. You don't understand the complexities, the pressures, Robert. He was at his wit's end, Sarah. She just wouldn't listen to reason. She was becoming a danger to herself. I was just trying to help to mediate a difficult situation, for everyone's sake. He fumbled for words, his official-sounding platitudes now sounding obscene. Sometimes hard choices have to be made for the greater good, for peace in a family. Surely you can understand that, Joe, we were family once. Oh, I understand perfectly, Ben. Josephine's voice was deadly calm, preternaturally. So each word a shard of ice, driven with surgical precision into his rapidly crumbling composure. A sudden vivid memory flashed through her mind. Ben Younger laughing genuinely with Sarah at a summer picnic years ago, before Robert's dark moods had soured everything. Before Sarah's spirit had begun to fray under relentless pressure. He'd even helped Sarah fix a section of fence once, his manner gentle, his laughter easy. The memory, so innocent, now felt like a poisoned dart. Her hand trembled on the Winchester for a bare second. The invocation of family was a viper's sting, liar. Her mind screamed. All the confusion, all the gnawing doubts, all the years of unvoiced corrosive suspicion about Sarah's true fate coalesced in that terrible instant into a single devastating crystalline certainty. Were how many, Ben? How many women have you helped transfer to that place? How many children have you seen torn from their mother's arms, their cries echoing in your damned ears? Was Sarah just another complexity in your dirty ledger? Did you stand by and watch them take her, Ben? Did you sign the papers that effectively condemned my sister to her grave, all while offering your false, insincere condolences to my grieving father and me, patting our hands and telling us it was God's will? Coulter's face was a mask of glistening sweat and abject desperation. His eyes darted wildly between Josephine, the darkened windows of the ranch house, now visibly bristling with unseen rifles, and Thomas, who now looked utterly petrified, realizing the tide had turned catastrophically against them. They were difficult women. He stammered the official platitudes, sounding hollow, empty, and utterly obscene in the charged, condemning air. Troubled women, all of them, and they needed specialized care, strict supervision. The settlement offered structure, moral rehabilitation, a chance to heal, for God's sake. Joe, I just followed procedure. I had my orders. Care. Josephine spat the word like a viper spitting venom. Is that what you call it? Ben drugging them into mindless, drooling submission, branding them like cattle so they can't escape, stealing their children to be sold off like property or enslaved within those cursed walls. Was that the structure Sarah received? Was that the care that led to her convenient, unexplained death? Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, now shot through with forks of avenging lightning locked onto his. In them, Coulter saw not just the righteous fury of a woman defending another, but the searing, intensely personal grief of a sister, betrayed a deep, aching pain, sharpened to a razor's edge over 5 long years of doubt, unanswered questions, and suppressed rage. He saw his own profound, undeniable culpability reflected there, stark, brutal, and inescapable. His hand, as if by its own volition, no longer able to bear the weight of her gaze, twitched, then jerked convulsively towards the Colt, holstered at his hip, a desperate cornered animal's final reflexive lunge. You leave me no choice, Josephine. He screamed, a desperate cracking sound as he drew. He even managed to get a wild, panicked shot off the bullet, singing harmlessly past Josephine's head and thudding into the solid log wall of the ranch house. He was fast trained by his profession, by years of enforcing his version of the law. But Josephine, fueled by 5 long years of unanswered questions, by the fresh, raw, visceral horror of Eliza's plight, by the tangible threat to the innocent children cowering behind her, and by a cold, consuming, righteous rage that had finally found its singular, deserving focus, was a singularity of deadly purpose. The Winchester in her hands seemed an extension of her own steely, unbending will. It bucked once powerfully against her shoulder. The report thunderous, definitive, shattering the twilight stillness into 1,000 echoing pieces. Ben Coulter jerked violently in the saddle, a look of pure, dumbfounded shock spreading across his face. He clutched instinctively at his chest, where a dark, rapidly blossoming stain appeared vividly, obscenely on his deputy's vest. He swayed precariously for a long moment, his mouth opening as if to speak a name, Sarah Josephine Forgiveness, then pitched forward unceremoniously, hitting the dusty ground with a sickening final thud, a fleeting flicker of pain, of something irrevocably lost. the ghost of a young man who had once seemed decent, perhaps even kind, crossed Josephine's face for an instant before her expression hardened once more into unyielding iron resolve. The sudden ringing silence after the gunshot was profound, broken only by the panicked snorting of the horses and a dry, racking sob that escaped Eliza. Thomas Miller let out a high-pitched, keening wail, a sound of pure, abject animal terror. Guise, the other hired man, who had frozen mid-lunge on the porch floor at the sight of a lawman drawing against Josephine, and then being so decisively shot down, now stared aghast and pale at Coulter's fallen, motionless body. Hearing the distinct, ominous click of multiple rifle hammers being drawn back from the darkened ranch house windows, and seeing the unyielding, avenging angel look on Josephine's face, he dropped his own weapon as if it were red-hot and threw his hands high above his head, his bravado utterly extinguished. "Don't shoot, please don't shoot," he babbled, his voice cracking. "I'm just hired muscle. I swear I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know it was like this." Miller just said retrieve property. He said she was a runaway, touched in the head. He never said nothing about any of this. It was over. The storm had broken violently, irrevocably, in the stunned, ringing silence that followed, broken only by Thomas's pathetic, whimpering sobs and the whinnying of the spooked horses. Josephine slowly lowered her rifle, her face pale but resolute in the flickering lamplight. She looked at Eliza, her eyes filled with a grim, weary understanding. "It had to be done, Eliza," she said softly, her voice rough with emotion. "For Sarah, for you, for all of them, some debts can only be paid in blood." The aftermath was swift, and for many devastatingly far-reaching. The local sheriff, a man initially inclined to dismiss the entire incident as a tragic domestic dispute, tragically escalated by overwrought women and hot-headed men, found himself facing an irate, powerfully influential rancher in Daniel Carter, who refused to be silenced or placated, a grieving, determined woman with a Winchester rifle that had tasted blood in defense of innocence, and a meticulously detailed, legally binding contract that implicated prominent local citizens, including one of his own deputies, the now-deceased Ben Coulter. The contract, coupled with Josephine's unwavering, articulate testimony about her brother-in-law's long-term suspicious involvement in Sarah's committal, and her damning, deeply held suspicions about her sister's true fate. Suspicions now lent terrifying credence by his desperate actions at the ranch, became an undeniable, explosive fuse. A full territory-wide investigation was launched, fueled by Daniel Carter's relentless pressure through his considerable connections in the territorial capital, and Josephine's fierce refusal to let Sarah's memory be dishonored, or Ben Coulter's deep-seated corruption be quietly swept under the rug. The Moral Reform Settlement of Redemption County, and soon others like it that began to come to light across several territories, were exposed for what they truly were: profitable, brutal prisons disguised as sanctuaries fueled by unbridled greed, and a chilling, brutal disregard for basic human dignity and the established rule of law. The network built on secrecy, coercion, and the pervasive abuse of power by men in trusted positions began to crumble under the weight of federal scrutiny. Bankers, pastors, lawmen, men who had for years presented themselves as unimpeachable pillars of the community, were arrested, their carefully constructed facades of respectability crumbling to reveal the rot hypocrisy and deep-seated corruption beneath dozens of women, some lost for years, dismissed by their families and communities as mad, hysterical, or incorrigible, were found dazed, malnourished, and psychologically broken, but alive. Children, some of whom had never known life outside those walls, were reunited with bewildered families who had thought them long gone or placed in genuine, compassionate care. The stories that emerged were harrowing, unspeakable tales of systemic abuse, routine, drugging, forced labor, and insidious psychological torture, but also, remarkably, of incredible resilience, quiet acts of defiance, and the enduring, unbreakable bonds of motherhood and sisterhood. forged in the darkest of crucibles. Thomas Miller stripped of his leverage. His cruel, desperate gamble utterly and catastrophically failed, and facing a battery of serious charges, including conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, and complicity in the illegal confinement of his wife. And children cooperated fully with the authorities. His blustering bravado was long gone, replaced by a pathetic, sniveling fear for his own skin. He would spend many, many years in a bleak federal prison, a fittingly grim and lonely end for a man who had callously tried to sell his family for a handful of silver. Eliza stayed at the Carter Ranch, gradually finding a new rhythm to her days. A rhythm no longer dictated by constant fear and oppressive silence, but by the gentle, life-affirming routines of caring for her beloved sons and helping Martha and Josephine, where she could on the sprawling, busy, and surprisingly welcoming ranch. The vastness of the prairie, once a symbol of her terrifying isolation and vulnerability, now felt strangely protective. A broad, sheltering canvas, watched over by the quiet, unwavering strength of Josephine Carter and her father. Her sons, Ethan and Samuel, thrived under the warm prairie sun and the devoted, loving care of two strong, remarkable women. Their first gurgling laughs echoed in the spacious, sunlit rooms of the ranch house. Their small, eager hands grasping for Josephine's calloused, capable fingers almost as often as they did for Eliza's. One golden afternoon, watching them tumbling and shrieking with pure, unadulterated joy in the soft grass near the porch, their antics blessedly ordinary and utterly carefree. Eliza felt a knot she hadn't realized she still carried in the deepest, most hidden part of her. Finally, fully and completely unwind, she breathed deep the prairie air, tasting of sunshine, wildflowers, and a freedom so profound it was almost dizzying. It was a freedom she realized she had never truly known before. The searing memory of those terrible, desperate days in the wilderness, of her bare, bleeding feet, and the gnawing, corrosive fear that had been her constant, unwelcome companion, began to recede, becoming a scar that still powerfully reminded her of the wound, but no longer throbbed with constant, debilitating pain. It was slowly being replaced by a sense of profound, overwhelming gratitude, and a burgeoning quiet strength she now recognized and proudly owned as her own. She and Josephine, their extraordinary bond, forged in the searing crucible of shared trauma, devastating loss, and righteous cleansing anger, became more than mere friends. They were sisters of the heart, partners in a fight they both knew, with a grim certainty, was far from over. "There are other Elizas out there, Joe," she said one cool evening as they sat on the porch watching the first stars prick the vast darkening sky. A breathtaking diamond-strewn tapestry unfurling above them, other children at risk every day. Other Sarahs whose stories were silenced, whose lives were stolen. We can't let what happened to us to her, to so many others, ever happen again. We have to be a voice for them. With the powerful backing of Josephine's father, who, moved by Eliza's story and his daughter's unwavering conviction, donated a significant portion of his fertile land, and the growing support of a community slowly, painfully awakening to the grave injustices that had festered unseen in its midst for far too long, and they co-founded a new kind of settlement, not a place of punishment, reform, or moral judgment, but a genuine refuge, a true sanctuary for mothers on the run, for women escaping abuse and systemic injustice. A safe haven where children would be cherished and protected, and where the only thing traded was protection for truth, solidarity for solace, and hope for despair. A few years later, they stood before a small group of newly arrived women at the haven, their faces a mixture of fear and fragile hope. Eliza gently explained how to identify wild edible plants that could sustain them if ever they found themselves alone, while Josephine, her voice firm but kind, demonstrated basic self-defense maneuvers, instilling not fear but confidence. Their shared smiles, their calm demeanors conveyed a strength that was now a beacon, a resilience born from their own harrowing pasts, ensuring that no woman who came to the haven would ever have to face the darkness alone as they once had. They were not just teaching survival, they were teaching rebirth. One afternoon, a weary but determined woman named Maria arrived at their gate clutching a toddler's hand and a tattered hand-drawn map. She had escaped a violent husband who, in his rages, had threatened her with consignment to the Redemption House. Someone in town, a baker's wife, whispered to me about this place. Maria had said, tears in her eyes. She called it a light in the deepest dark. She said brave women lived here, women who understood. It was a testament to the haven's growing vital reputation. The haven was built on the fertile, welcoming ground of the Carter Ranch, a living testament to courage, compassion, and the unbreakable, indomitable spirit of two women who had stared into the abyss. And instead of cursing, the darkness had chosen to light a blazing, defiant candle. The simple sign above the gate, carved into weathered pine by Daniel Carter himself, with Ethan's and Samuel's slightly larger handprints, now pressed permanently into the drying varnish on the back, read simply, "The Haven Shelter Truth Hope." And for every woman bruised but not broken, who found her way through its welcoming doors, often clutching a child and a harrowing story of despair, it was exactly that. A new beginning under a wide, watchful, and finally benevolent sky.